interdisciplinary, apply to real problem approaches, opportunities to engage with others who have similar interests and sensibilities. Utopia's educational approach is based on established learning communities, the so-called collected learning communities, not only including staff, students, and also non-academic partners. So enhancing a global interdisciplinary problem-solving dimensions. So a group of experts from leading universities across Europe have started an experiment about multilingualism and diversity. Multilingualism as a tool to explore the local relevance of global problems. What is the aim? The aim is to empower the students, and not only the students, and provide them with tools to understand and value diversity. We need to transcend linguistic and cultural barriers in order to solve the complex problems of today and becoming really, truly inclusive. Today, two of our learning communities, the one on multilingualism and diversity and the one on text and discourse analysis, joined forces to establish a week-long event celebrating the value of languages, culture, and diversity across their lives. This is the value, the meaning of the Utopian Languages Week. The aims of the event today to see diversity and unlocking its power at the heart of European education. For us to be engaged and excited with diversity, empowered as users of one of many languages in multilingual and multicultural ecosystems. Discover new meanings and the richness of cultural diversity represented in the multilingual campuses of our lines. Engage with diversity and understanding why it is fundamentally important, how it adds value to our society's education, research, to our world, and celebrate our community, Utopia community, and learn from each other. The first Utopia Languages Week starts today and runs until Friday. It consists of a series of activities revolving around languages, multilingualism, and cultures in each institution. Several cross-universities activities are offered. You can find more details in the website and also on the website of the participating institution. The first event is an opening plenary delivered by Professor Panos Athanasopoulos on what language is good for. Languages bring color and life in our world. They bring culture, philosophy, ethics, different ethics, and teach us how to be inclusive. So the question how, and I leave the floor to Professor Athanasopoulos, is how they affect our brain. So before giving the floor to Professor Athanasopoulos, I give the floor to Professor Joe Anguri, Professor in Social Linguistics at the University of Warwick, and member of the Central Education Team of Utopia Alliance. To introduce the speaker, I wish you a great session today and to our students to explore language and culture and what Utopia can bring to you in the first exciting festival of diversity. And I wish to thank Jo Anguri for her passions and all efforts, together with other colleagues, of course, she put in organizing this Languages Week. Thank you so much, and I wish you a good day and a good week in the languages. Thank you, Jo.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It is really a privilege to have the opportunity to be part of the inaugural event. Thank you so much, Tatiana, for this introduction and for being with us. We are very much in the middle of a semester on a Monday, in the middle of a day, and actually the commitment of everybody in this room and everybody who actually made this event possible really speaks to what we want to achieve. And of course, the support in all the 10 universities that make Utopia is really important. And we hope that for all those of you in this room, you'll make the most of it. So, introducing Panos. This is both a very easy and a very difficult task. He's a scholar whose research speaks and overall profile speaks to all the qualities Tiziana mentioned in terms of what we want the modern university to offer to society, to our students, to the learning. So he's an international, very innovative, very interdisciplinary, very relevant to the society's big questions scholar. So it's a really great pleasure. Panos' area is in psycholinguistics, experimental psycholinguistics, cognitive linguistics, bilingual cognition, cultural relativity, language learning acquisition. However, those discipline labels, which are very fuzzy, they don't really do justice to what actually Panos' work is trying to do. And his record is very impressive. You know that I'm a very big fan of using all the multimedia way of bringing information, so you can Google and find all the various great things he has written. I'm not going to list them. So he has a really impressive record. What is really very impressive was his commitment to really go beyond boundaries of all those sort of discipline labels that I've used to introduce him since his PhD at the University of Essex in 2006, which is where we first met. So he developed, as a PhD student, a framework for studying cognition, where he already wanted to cross the boundaries of psycholinguistics and experimental psychology. For his work, he earned awards, he wrote a number of publications. It's quite interesting to see for a scholar who is still very young, and this is not negotiable, we are very young, has actually a really impressive record of citations, of reach and impact of the work he has done. What is actually also very important is that he started the journey on multidisciplinarity and multidisciplinary methodological expertise, which for the students amongst us today, you will have heard a number of us saying how important it is that you find a way to cross disciplinary boundaries, but that does not mean that anything goes. Interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity doesn't mean doing a little bit of everything. It means developing tools of really bringing disciplinary excellence in interdisciplinary ways of addressing questions. So he pioneered experimental paradigms to study perception and also using methods from cognitive neuroscience. He's currently a professor of applied linguistics at Lancaster University and also an extraordinary professor at Stellenbosch. He's the director of the Perception and Learning Lab at Lancaster. And what is very important in the work of that lab and in the work that Panos does is really the ability to bring together those different lines of inquiry, to ask the questions that have been driving his work from the very start. Do speakers of different languages think differently? Do we see the world? What is the actual limits or what is the actual sort of boundaries that multilinguals cross or can cross and so on? It is also, as probably most great researchers, is also a great teacher and a great supervisor. He cares immensely about his teaching, and we often talk about how teaching is very important part of how we learn in a journey with our students. And what really characterizes him is the passion and enthusiasm, which I personally experienced participating in a whole range of different experiments about my blues and how many blues I can see. And if anybody's interested, I can tell you all sorts of stories about what I've learned through participating to Panos' experiments when we were both PhD students. And what I still see in Panos today is the same passion and enthusiasm for crossing boundaries and really providing answers to some very complex questions that really go to the heart of the role of language, which is what he's going to talk to us about today. So it is a pleasure and a privilege to introduce a great scholar and a great friend who made time in his very busy schedule to be with us today and to share the way he is now seeing the world after all the years of this great work. So please join me in welcoming Professor Athanasopoulos to the floor. Thank you.
How do you follow that? Well, thank you, first of all, to you, Joe, for inviting me for the wonderful introduction. I hope I'm going to live up to half the things that you said. Thank you also to Melina for helping me with the organization. And thank you to you in the room and to the people online who are here today to join us. It's an immense privilege. I didn't know this was the inaugural Utopia event. So this is the very first lecture. So yeah, it gives great pleasure to be giving this. Okay, so does learning a new language rewire your brain? It's a question that comes right out of Hollywood. It is actually, I was inspired by a Hollywood movie. So let's turn this into an afternoon movie quiz. Who can tell me where this image comes from, which movie? Of course it does. We're linguistics, language students, we should know it. So this is the movie Arrival, right? With Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner. And in the movie, well, it's Hollywood, so bear with me, aliens visit the Earth. Never happened before in Hollywood movies. They come to Earth, and this time, they don't want to destroy us yet. They want to tell us something. They've got a message for us. Problem is, they don't speak our language, and we don't speak their language. So, enter the expert, a linguist. Wow, a linguist playing the lead role in a Hollywood movie. Never happened before. Truly never happened before. This is Amy Adams, who plays a linguist, Louise Banks, and she comes in to try and decipher the aliens' language. What she's doing is deciphering the writing system to try and decode the meaning behind it. And when the movie came out, I think it was 2016 or 2017, my brother called me, and I hadn't watched it yet. He said, "Oh, Panos, you have to see this movie. It's all about the stuff that you are researching. It's really interesting." I said, "Yeah, I don't know though. I mean, they probably, made a mockery out of linguistics. It's all inaccurate, blah, blah, blah." And then I watched it, and I was really surprised at how accurate it was. Well, it was half accurate. So the movie is about language and time travel. Time travel is impossible. It can't happen. So already spoiler there. But it was accurate in the sort of linguistic theories and ideas that it puts forward. So there's a dialogue in the movie. So Amy Adams is the linguist, and Jeremy Renner is a biologist, I think, and they work together with the aliens. And the character of Jeremy Renner says to Amy Adams, I was doing some reading that if you immerse yourself into a foreign language, you can actually rewire your brain. And then the expert, Amy Adams, replies, yeah, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the theory that the language you speak determines how you think. And the whole movie is about that, about not just learning a language, but what happens to your belief systems, your perception, your vision of the world once you've learned that language. So I'll try, for those of you who haven't seen the movie, I'll try not to give too many spoilers, but when Louise Banks eventually deciphers the code of the alien language, she starts experiencing time differently, right, herself. So it is interesting that these issues have become so mainstream that a hypothesis that is real, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis exists, for those of you who don't know. It is a theory of linguistics that says indeed that language can influence, can affect the way that we think and perceive the world. So this kind of rewiring is what I'm going to be talking about. So we take this question, does learning a new language rewire the brain? And I'm going to try to sort of analyze what it really means in terms of actual linguistic research. My case studies come from vision. I'll be looking at color and object perception. And then in the latter half of the talk, I'll be looking at decision-making. I'll be talking about moral versus utilitarian judgments and whether using the first or the second language matters in that case. But I'm going to start with the material world. I'm going to start with effects on vision, and I'm going to look at color and object perception. But I think, yes, before I do that, I want to take a step back and consider a slightly different question, a much more basic, a much more fundamental question than a second language. Does language rewire our brain? So does having a label for something do something to our vision of the world? It's a much more basic question, and let's do some brain rewiring right now. So I'm going to show you an image, and you may already be familiar with the image that I'm going to show you. If you are familiar, please do not shout out the answer. Let your colleagues who are not familiar have the wow moment for themselves. So I'm going to show you a simple picture. All I want you to do is tell me, what do you see? It's the first thing that comes to your mind. Anyone? The obvious thing. Bricks, yes, correct. Any other answers? Yeah, brick wall, perfect, correct. Any other takers?
Jackets.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is there like a turtle in between two bricks? I don't know what that is.
A turtle? Why not? But I'm not going to say if it's correct or not. Yeah.
Gaps.
So gaps. Yes, there are gaps for sure. Anyone else? Yeah.
A cigar.
Cigar. Okay. Can you see the cigar? It's like a wave of understanding, of people nodding, smiling. Some people are still, what? Who cannot see the cigar? It's fine, you're normal, everything is cool, you're not, you know. So sometimes when I ask people what do they see, of course, all of them are correct answers. You can see a wall, some gaps, and some people mention a pebble here. They say, oh, it's a pebble there. That's actually the ash tip of the cigar. So it's the pebble, the ash tip, that's the body of the cigar, embedded on the wall. Can you guys see it now? Okay. Right, so one word fine-tunes our vision to something that our eyes could perceive earlier. We could not see the cigar. We just didn't know that we were seeing the cigar. So it's like it's actually throwing a pebble into a pond, and you get ripples, right? Waves. And we search on semantic memory and we find that word. But we don't just find the word. We find everything else associated with that word. Images of what it looks like. For many people, it could be the smell of a cigar or a memory, you know, or indeed a personal experience with a person that smoked a cigar, or if you smoke a cigar as well. So one word has that kind of effect. And in fact, this is what it means to say that language is rewiring our brain. Why? Because from now on, I want to say I've changed your lives, but maybe I have, maybe I haven't. But from now on, when you see this image, you'll never be able to unsee the cigar. The perceptual system is rewired in a way that you'll always be aware that there is a cigar there. It's impossible to miss it now. Whereas before, many of you are completely oblivious to it. Now,
we have a question here. What's people who cannot see the cigar still?
other people who can still not see the cigar.
They're not going to vote to raise
It's
their
fine.
hand. There are
It's fine. Yeah.
in this room.
I would say give the advice that you get earlier. Go on Google and go cigar visual illusion, and then hopefully it will become clearer.
This one looks more like a gap than that one.
Now imagine that there is a language, a hypothetical language out there that doesn't have a word for cigar. Does it mean that speakers of that language have a fundamentally different vision of the world from people that have a word for cigar? Well, this has actually been the focus of decades of research, not with cigars and walls, but with color. So color perception is the domain par excellence to look at these cross-linguistic differences in how we carve up reality, how we carve up the visible spectrum. So the bedrock of looking at language and thought is linguistic diversity. And color is so popular, it's been studied for decades, because there is rampant diversity in how different languages carve up the spectrum. So you have languages like, for example, Dani in West Papua, that only have two terms. A term that denotes all the light colors and a term that denotes all the darker colors. In fact, it's debatable whether the concept of color itself is the same in these cultures, because the light term really means warm, whereas the dark term means cool. So color is more of a sensation than a visual experience. And there are languages with 3 terms, so they add to the light and the dark term, they add a red term that also subsumes purple and orange. And in fact, over half of the world's languages have 5 terms: black, white, red, yellow, and a term that linguists call grue, which subsumes both green and blue. So these cultures are in Namibia, the Himba, the Bermuda, Papua New Guinea, historically also Chinese, Japanese, and Welsh, closer to home, had this grue term. And then we also have languages, and this is going to be the focus of case study today, that have separate terms for light and dark blue. My native language, Greek, is one of those, where there is a basic term for light blue and a basic term for dark blue. And they're very distinct. They are mutually exclusive in many contexts. So, for example, the sky you would never call black, it's dark blue, and so on. Russian is another language that works like this. Turkish and other languages are Italian, Spanish, Japanese, and so on. And I'm putting the globe here where all these languages are spoken, just to also appreciate the geographic diversity that exists in how these languages, in where these languages are located. Okay, so time to sing the blues. So how do we, so if you are a speaker of these languages, what does it mean? What do you mean when you say blue in your second language? Do you mean dark blue or light blue? What about your native contrasts? You know, do you perceive ble and galazio the same way that native speakers of Greek who don't know any English do? So this is one of the first tasks that I sought out to do when I was still in Essex, and I think Joe is a participant in this experiment, actually. Show me your best blues. So this is like a classic sort of linguistic ethnography here. You go out in the field with the color charts. This is the Mansell color chart, and you get your participants to write down all the color terms that they can think of, and then you ask them for exemplars of this term. You said, pick the one stimulus, the one square, whatever that best represents the color blue in this case. And here, when we do this kind of semantic mapping task, we find that English native speakers typically go for that square. Of course, there's a lot of individual variation here, right? So for some people it's darker, for some people it's lighter, but they all congregate around this sort of cluster there. So I took this task and I gave it to Greek functional monolinguals. They were living in Greece and not in contact with English. And I asked them for the Greek prototypes for ble and galazio to establish, first of all, to what degree they were similar to the English blue prototype. And here they are. So this is the dark blue prototype, which is sort of, it's dark, close to the English blue, but also a bit more like towards purple and a bit darker as well. And light blue is miles away from, the galazio prototype is miles away from English blue, so much lighter and then sort of towards the green hue area. And then I asked the same question to Greek-English bilinguals in the UK. So show me your best blend, your best galazio, and this is what they showed me. So here, the dark blue term was identical to the English blue, so a complete shift towards the second language. But even the light blue term was different, right? So it was even lighter than the monolingual term, right? But it had moved horizontally. It moved towards where the English blue was. So this was like a first indication that something interesting is happening with these bilinguals. You know, what they say, what they mean when they say ble and galazio, their native terms, is not quite the same as what their peers back in Greece are thinking, are meaning when they are using these terms. So that prompted me to then go and look inside people's heads. So here we wanted to look at whether these semantic differences in the way that we carve up semantic space have actually effects for visual processing for how our brain perceives the distinctions in color. So here we use a technique called event-related brain potentials. So we essentially this is my brother, by the way, second appearance today. He told me about the movie Arrival years later. But he's taking part in one of our experiments here on Greek blues. So he has to wear this cap with electrodes, and what the electrodes do is they detect electrical activity in the brain millisecond by millisecond. Okay, so just to give you an idea, like 1 second is an eternity for any of the study. We're talking about things that happen 100 milliseconds for stimulus, 200 milliseconds, 300, you get to 500, half a second, that's already too long. You know, so we're really wanting to go as low level as possible to see what's happening with vision. Now, I'll talk about electrodes and electrical activity. I should say that yes, the human brain has between 10 and 100 billion nerve cells, neurons, and everything we do or say has a physical correlate, and that physical correlate is electrical activity. So if we track this electrical activity in the brain as it's happening, and then if we stimulate the brain with something, then we get the brain's reaction to that something that we presented on the screen. So let's stimulate our brains today. So this is one of the experiments that we conducted. You're going to see some stimuli appear at the center of this virtual screen here. I'd like you to raise your right hand, please, if you see a square. Okay. So very simple. Oh, they're going to be very fast as well, so pay attention. So there we go. Perfect, thank you. You're not blind, great. So of course, everybody can see the square. That's not a task, right? You can guess where this is going because there was another perceptual difference there. Did you notice what it was? Sometimes the luminance changes. So every so often, you got either a circle or a square that was a darker shade of blue, and this is what we are interested in. So this is the task here in full glory. We gave the task to Greek and English speakers, and we instructed them to respond where they saw a square. They didn't have to raise their hands; they had to press a key on the keyboard. And so we tell them that the target is a square to sort of kind of fool them, deviate their attention to something irrelevant to the task. What we're really interested in is not how the brain will respond to the target, because of course you're going to get a massive effect, because we told the brain to expect the target. We're interested in how they're going to respond to the so-called deviant stimulus. So the stimulus that changes in luminance every so often. So it's a completely passive response. You don't expect it in the stream of stimuli. Yet the brain will respond. Why? Because it saw something different. It can't help but respond, and that response is an increase in amplitude in electrical activity. So this is what we want to know: how the brain would respond unconsciously to differences in luminance. And we had blocks where the standard was a light blue and the deviant was a dark blue and vice versa. And then we also have green as a control color here. Why? Because in Greek and English, green has one basic term. So there shouldn't be any difference between how Greek and English speakers perceive dark and light green, right? But there should be a difference in how they perceive dark and light blue, because Greek has two basic terms for blue, whereas English has one. But let's see some brainwaves and see what's happened actually. So this is the chart for the English participants. The effects we're looking at, so I told you before, 1,000 milliseconds, 1 second is an eternity here. This is the horizontal axis here. On the vertical axis, you have amplitude measured in microvolts. So this is the electrical activity that we are measuring. And we're looking at the time frame of between 160 and 220 milliseconds, about 1/5 of a second post-stimulus, how the brain will react. It's a very, very quick reaction. And here we have the brainwave for the standard green. So these are many, for example, many light greens, flashing and flashing and flashing. They will have about, I don't know, 500 stimuli. So by the end, my brother George, he was almost falling asleep when he did this. But yeah, you need to do this to get a lot of data to analyze. So this is how the brain responds to the standard green. That's all good, that's all fine. This is how the brain responds to the deviant green. So this is when the dark green pops up. Every so often, you see the jump in electrical activity. That it means that the brain has noticed the change in luminance, even if you're not consciously aware of it. A lot of participants afterwards couldn't recall, how many dark greens they saw, or even if they saw any dark greens. And this is the response for blue, the standard blue and the deviant blue. So again, English participants notice the change in luminance. Okay. Good. Again, that means they're not blind. They can see that there is, the brain can perceive the difference in luminance. This is the brain of the Greek participants. So same time window, around 100 milliseconds. Our baseline for standard green, our deviant for a green that changes in lightness, and Greeks, like the English speakers, perceive the difference. The brain actually registers the difference. And this is for the blue. So this is the standard blue, and this is what happens when it changes in luminance. And now we have a much larger jump in electrical activity. Right? So much larger than the one that we saw for the greens. Okay? So this is really interesting because it tells us something that sometimes speaks to the heart of these language thoughts investigations. So one kind of popular but also misleading way to interpret the idea of language shaping our perception of speakers of different languages thinking or perceiving the world differently is to say that if you don't have a word for a concept in your language, you cannot see, you cannot perceive that concept. And what this tells us is that this idea is wrong, because English speakers can also perceive the difference in lightness between dark and light blue and between dark and light green. It does that Greek speakers perceive it more. They pay more attention when the blue changes in lightness than when the green does. So it kind of makes us think of language as this attention-directed mechanism, this advertising board that highlights different aspects of reality. But everything is visible. We can see it, just like the cigar experiment earlier. We can see what's happening. Our brain registers all the perceptual stimulation that it receives. So what seems to differ between speakers of different languages is how much attention they pay to those distinctions. And it becomes profoundly interesting with bilinguals, because when we look at the profile of bilingual people, so here the variable that we looked at was how long these bilinguals stayed in the UK. There were university students in the UK when we did the experiment. So I'm going to show you first. So this is the English monolingual pattern, the distinctions between the light and dark blues and light and dark greens, and we saw earlier that they are similar. So they see the difference in lightness, but to the same degree. And this is the distinction for short-stay bilinguals between 3 and 6 months. So these are Greek native speakers that have stayed in the UK between 3 and 6 months, and there is a big difference still. So the native contrasts are still pretty much etched in their brain. And this is the brainwave of long-stay bilinguals, at least 2 years, which was in fact between 2 and 9 years here. The distinction is still there. It's just not as prominent. Okay? So it seems as if, well, you've lived here a long time and you are using English very often. So you start to kind of, not have your native categories as activated as your peers who have lived in the UK for less time. So we show this difference in color, and we have now new data from objects. Well, because color is kind of also, it's easy to study because it's a continuum, really. So you can find more or less, it's not difficult to find cross-linguistic variation on a continuum. Languages seem to, there are some principles, but it seems that most languages seem to arbitrarily carve up color space. Our current project is focused on objects. And we look at how different languages partition common household objects. You'd be surprised at how much cross-linguistic diversity there is in common household objects with very specific functions. Yet, languages label them very, very differently. So we look at these very common objects here, and in English, I've learned this very late actually. I started speaking English when I started learning English when I was 6. In fact, I could write in English first before I could in Greek. But still, I wasn't even sure about this distinction. Cup and mug. Don't know, really? To me, they're the same, because in Greek we use only one term for these things. So this is a cup. The thing on the top left is a cup. The thing on the top right is a mug, apparently. And the things at the bottom are both glasses. Okay, glass. But in a language like Spanish, it works the other way around. So in Spanish, the things at the bottom are lexically partitioned. Copa is the wine glass, and vaso is the beaker or water glass, and the things at the top are called vaso. So no lexical distinction there. So we gave a similar task, like the color task, where people had to see lots of stimuli with standards and deviants, and here the deviants and the standards represented different lexical distinctions in the languages, and we have perfect double dissociation here. So we have increased brain activity in Spanish native speakers to the Spanish lexical contrast. So this is the upper left here. So when they see the copa-vaso distinction, the brain immediately says, oh, wait a minute, two different things. But not to the English lexical contrast. This is upper right. So when they say cup and a mug, the brain doesn't seem to care that much, because in Spanish these things are called the same. And we have the complete reverse for English speakers at the bottom. So there is increased brain activity for the cup mug distinction, bottom right, but actually almost no jumping brain activity for the Spanish contrast, the copa-vaso. So both glasses for English speakers. So now we are doing this with bilingual speakers to see to what extent they resemble either monolingual speakers. So red hot data. I hope to be able to tell you more in the future about this. But this is where we are at the minute with objects and vision. So this brings me to the close of the first half of my talk, which was to focus on vision and color and object perception, and to give you an idea of what it means for language to rewire a brain, what happens to the brain in terms of perceiving categorical contrasts. Now, for the second part, I'll still stay with the brain. I'll still stay with second language rewiring the brain. But I'll talk about decision making. I'll talk about the interaction of language and another domain of human experience, which is affect, emotion. Okay, so let's begin with a bit of background first. Okay, so generally, there are two ways to think about things when we consider how humans reason. One way is the affective route. This is the so-called quick and dirty way to think about something. It's fast. It's your gut feeling, basically. It's like, oh, this feels right, I'm gonna do it. It's fast, it's unconscious, you don't really analyze it or mull over it too much, you just do it. And it's emotionally charged often. You let your feelings, emotions take over. The other way to do it is to be analytical. So here, this is a systematic way of thinking, slower than the affective route. It's analytical. You tend to consider many different possible course of actions, and then you weigh up the pros and the cons, and you act accordingly. It's governed by rules, and it's cognition intensive instead of emotionally charged. You leave your emotions out the window, and you are trying to think and analyze the situation. And we do both, actually, and both are good. There's not one that one is like defective in some way, and the other one has any advantages. Well, the advantages are relative. Sometimes it's good to be quick and dirty. Sometimes it's good to be slow and reasonable. Now, the two ways to think about things rely on different sources, obviously. One relies on emotion and instinct, the other one relies on logic and usefulness, utility. Now, we know from psycholinguistic studies on emotion that there is some kind of connection between the languages of the bilingual and these two different ways to think about things. So these are decades of experiments that look, for example, at how people self-report and how they use emotions in the first versus the second or foreign languages. And most people who report, most bilinguals or multilinguals, will say that their first language feels more emotional. It's the language that you use to express your strong emotions like love or swear words, seem heavier in your first language than your second language. One thing that I do constantly in the house is swear in English. And my wife, sometimes who's British, is shocked. So, you swear like Ozzy Osbourne, calm down. So, yeah, but to me, it doesn't feel, she said, would you do it in Greek? Never. I would never swear this much in Greek. Why? Because it's taboo. Well, it's like, it carries emotional weight. In English, it doesn't mean that much. The same with love. There are cultural differences as well there, but like in English, we say, yes, I love dearly my child, but I also love beer or watching Netflix. In Greek, if you say to somebody, I love you, you better have a ring ready, to propose. So things are serious. And these actually have effects, physical effects, because studies have been done where they attach, these electrodes that I showed you before that are stuck to my brother's head. So some researchers attach similar electrodes to the palm of the hand. And they show like words on the screen. They can be neutral words, but they can also be affect-rich words, like swear words, or whatever. And they measure sweat, how much, and again, it's tiny amounts, how much you're aroused by what you see on the screen. And what this study show is that you're aroused more if you see these affect-rich words in your first language than in your second language, which means that your first language has like a direct access to the emotional system of the brain, which is the limbic system. Why? Well, there are several hypotheses, actually. So one hypothesis is that you learn the first language is in an affect-rich context. Who speaks your first language for the first time? In most cases, people that really, really love you, your parents, your caregivers. So you just attach, emotionally to that language. Your second language, if you learn it even in childhood, you may learn it in a different context, in a classroom, in an environment that is emotionally detached, and things like that. So then if we bring these two things together, the mapping of languages to the limbic system and the two different ways to think about things, the affective route and the analytical route, we can come to some hypotheses here. And the hypothesis is that perhaps if you are thinking about things in your first language, you're going to take decisions that are governed by your instincts and emotions more than if you think about things in your second language, where you're going to take a more systematic, logical approach that favors utilitarian decisions. This is one of the, for those of you interested in bilingualism, multilingualism, sort of hottest topics right now in multilingualism research. There's the so-called foreign language effect in decision making. Do you make more logical decisions in your second language and more emotional decisions in your first language? So let's take a look at a couple of case studies here. Okay, this is the classic paradigm that's been used over the past 7 or 8 years. Imagine that you have an opportunity to save the lives of 5 people. But to save the 5 people, you must kill 1 person. Would you kill the 1 person, or would you do nothing and let the 5 people die? So here you have a direct conflict of the two decision-making systems that I described earlier. The moral imperative is don't take a life. Why are you asking me to kill 1 person? I don't want to kill 1 person. But the utilitarian imperative is that you sacrifice a life to save 5. Okay. No right or wrong decision. What are you going to do? Certainly, the language that you take the decision in shouldn't matter. There's no reason to say that if I make this decision in English or in Greek, in my case, would lead to a different outcome. Well, let's take a look. This is the research of one of my current PhD students who is doing this in Cyprus with Greek speakers. This is one of the moral dilemmas that she posed to her participants. There are many different, others, all of the same kind of scenario. So you're a doctor, imagine you're a doctor with a lab. You have 5 patients who will all die if they don't get an immediate organ transplant. Another patient is just being rushed to the hospital after a serious car accident. This person is critically injured, but you can probably save him by means of a long and complicated operation. The immoral. If you secretly administer a higher dose of anesthetic injection during surgery, it will cause his death, and you'll have the organs for the other 5 patients. This will kill him, but save the other 5 patients. Do you obtain the organs by administering a higher dose of anesthetic injection to the accident victims, so you can undertake the transplantations for the other 5 patients? So, ethics, actually, it's in your power. You can save 5 people, but you have to kill one person. What do you do? So, the student gave this scenario to Greek-English bilinguals in English, and then in Greek as well. And this is what she found. When the scenario was in English, people were much more willing to commit the action. They would administer the anesthetic to kill the patient and save the other 5. When they heard exactly the same scenario in Greek, they were more reluctant to do it. Somehow, it was more forceful, more real in their imagination. It was actually really interesting when we applied for ethical approval for this study, right? Because, I mean, this is one of the least kind of intense scenarios. There are worse ones. So for this kind of, because the research poses these ethical dilemmas, and it may cause distress to the participants. It's understandable. It goes through like the full shebang of ethical review. You have two reviewers reviewing it, and a whole ethics committee as well. And it was interesting that the most critical comments we got were from native English speakers when they read the scenarios in English, in their native language. The ones that didn't have English as a native language didn't have that much of a problem, you know. But it was the native English speakers that were on the committee that actually had a big problem with some of the scenarios. So this is the so-called foreign language effect. When you have to take these decisions in your foreign language, you tend to almost kind of think of the greater good and leave, you know, morals or ethics. Whereas if you do it in your first language, then the ethical load the emotional load is far higher. Okay, so this is an ethical dilemma, but the foreign language effect can also extend to biases that rely on emotion and instinct. And this is the next example here. Okay, so imagine you are Matt Hancock. I don't mean to insult you, but imagine that you're Matt Hancock when he was a health minister back in 2020. So COVID, a dangerous new disease, has been going around, and you have to make a decision. Without medicine, 600,000 people will die from this disease. In order to save these people, 2 types of medicine are being made. If you choose medicine A, 200 people will be saved, guaranteed. If you choose medicine B, there's a 33.3% chance that 600,000 people will be saved, so everybody will be saved, and a 66.6% chance that no one will be saved, everybody will die. Which medicine do you choose, A or B? Hands up for A. Okay. Hands up for B. Cool, okay, A, we can declare A safely a winner in this one. Okay, here comes another dilemma. You're still not Hancock, you're not Hancock. Okay. Right. Same scenario. Recently, a dangerous new disease has been going around. Without medicine, 600,000 people will die from it. In order to save them, 2 types of medicine are being made. If you choose medicine A, 400,000 people will die, guaranteed. If you choose medicine B, there's a 33.3% chance that no one will die, so everybody will survive, and a 6.6% chance that everybody will die. Which medicine do you choose, A or B? Hands up for A. Want to murder 400,000 people? Okay. Hands up for B. Oh, in a few more hands than before. That's interesting. Okay. Now, of course, the dilemma is the same, right? It's what changes the phrasing, or more accurately, the framing. This is why it's called the framing effect. So this is the framing effect. In the first scenario, I presented the dilemma as a game, and that's called game framing. So if you choose medicine A, 200,000 people will be saved. That's a gain, presenting it as a positive. B never changes, by the way. With B, there's always a 33% chance that everybody will die, and 50% chance that everybody will be saved, and 6% chance that everybody will die. So B always remains constant. It's A that changes. So when you present it as a game, then more people are likely to go for A. Why? Because it's the safe option. With B, you can lose everything, right? There's a higher chance that everybody will die. At least with A, at least you can save 1/3 of the population, right? So you go for the safe option. The second dilemma was presented as a loss. So here, with medicine A, 400,000 people will die, guaranteed. You know that there's going to be a loss. So in these cases, many people are likely to risk it, to go for medicine B, even though the dilemma is exactly the same, right? Because why? Because they're loss averse. They don't want to say, oh, I don't want 400,000 people to die, so I might as well go with B. Maybe I'll save everybody. Maybe we'll kill everybody as well. So again, it shouldn't really matter which language you present a dilemma in. It should always be the same decision. But of course it's not. So this is a study, one of the first studies actually, to look at the framing effect in relation to the foreign language effects. And here the researchers looked at English, Japanese bilinguals, English first language, Japanese second language. Half were tested in Japanese and half were tested in English, and they presented with the framing effects paradigm. So essentially choosing between a sure option and a risky option in two different framings, gain versus loss. And these are the findings. So you have on the horizontal axis the two different language contexts, English versus Japanese, and on the vertical axis you have the percentage of participants who selected the sure option, medicine A, as a function of frame and language. So these are English native speakers, and if we look at the profile in the English context, they go for the sure option, right? When it is presented as a game, so medicine A versus medicine B. So they don't go for the risky option when it's presented as a game. When they had to do the task in the second language, Japanese, there is no difference, right? So they actually understand that it's the same dilemma, more or less, so they're not biased by whether the dilemma is presented in the first language or in their second language, which speaks to this analytical way of thinking. If you start weighing up things and if you start thinking about it a little bit, then you realize that actually you're faced with the same dilemma. So doing it in the second language promotes this kind of thinking for these people. There are, over the past 3 or 4 years, there have been studies looking at people's attitudes towards common human activities, like, for example, flying or the fear of flying. So apparently, if you are thinking in your second language, you have less fear of flying than if you're thinking in your first language. So next time you're on a plane, it takes someone to reading a second language. The most interesting one, I think, one that I've also been trying to design an experiment around, is the so-called hot hand effect in gambling. So this refers to when you go to gamble, right? Sometimes you're winning a lot, and you think that you have a hot streak, that somebody up above is favoring you. That I want to roll. Of course, that's BS. Nobody's favoring you. It's just blind probability. That's what casinos make their money on. So the thing is that if you are gambling in your first language, you are more likely to gamble more because you think that you're on a hot streak. Right? If you do it in your second language, you are more likely to stop, take your winnings or cut your losses, and go. So you think about it more logically, you know. If you do it in your second language, whereas if you do it in your first language, you tend to assign some kind of affective qualities to luck, which is really blind. So yeah, if you ever go to a casino, don't do it in your first language, do it in your second language. Unless you're very rich, of course, and you like living dangerously. Okay, so I think I'm going to bring things to a close now. I just gave today a brief flavor of what it means to say that you can rewire your brain by learning a new language. I framed the question within the much larger question of language cognition interactions in the human brain. Having a label for something makes it pop up to your attention more than not having a label for that. And when you learn a new language, then your sensitivity to these distinctions is altered. And then I looked at the relationship between language and affect. And we saw here how thinking in a second language can lead you to make decisions that are different than if you were taking the same decisions in your first language, and make you think in a more utilitarian, logical way, and in a less emotionally charged way. Which again, this speaks to also a big question, you know, about how bilinguals experience the self themselves when they are speaking the different languages. People report that they're a different person when they are speaking their second language. But what does that really mean? You know, all we have had for decades is the testimonies of bilinguals, which is great. Of course, we want to hear from bilinguals, myself included. I want to hear myself, of course, about my experiences, my bilingual experiences. But it's nice to also take it to the laboratory and show really what it means to say that, you know, you are a different person. You have, well, the famous proverb says, learn a new language, get a new soul, or something like that, to see what it really means in everyday life for your decision making. So yeah, thanks a lot for coming, and if you have any questions, we'd like to.
Thank you so much, Panos, for this really engaging, stimulating, very cutting-edge and informed talk. I can't think of a better way to start what we're trying to achieve with the Languages Week. We have plenty of time for question and discussions. I'm going to open the floor, and please do ask anything that comes to mind as we actually have the opportunity to really unpick some of Panos's great work and sort of get more of the benefit of his thinking. So, yeah, go.
I actually have two questions.
Very good.
The first one, you showed us the difference between like monolingual English speakers, monolingual Greek speakers, and bilinguals in where they would place the prototype of blue or dark blue and light blue, or I've forgotten the Greek word. But was there also a difference in where they place the boundaries? Like if you gave them a list of blues and just asked them, is this light blue or dark blue? Was there a difference in where they would like switch?
Yeah, absolutely, of course, yes. There were different differences between the Greek monolinguals and the English monolinguals where they placed bound, because English monolinguals would most often name almost everything blue. So if I go back to the presentation. Yeah. So here, you know, people would, English speakers would, one way to elicit these boundaries is to take each of these squares individually and present them one by one to people, and they have to tell you the first name that comes to their mind. So it's a very quick kind of semantic memory task. And for most English speakers, this entire area was blue. Many use the term black for the really dark blue ones. And this is really interesting because I had a really fierce debate once with my Swedish colleague when we went to this museum in Philadelphia, I think, and we saw this beautiful piece of art. And to me, it obviously was dark blue. He said, no, but it's black. I said, no, but can you see it's blue? And this went on for the entire day. We missed like going to the Rocky statue in Philadelphia too, just because we're debating whether it's black or dark blue. Now, for Greek speakers, the boundary was around the middle, of the array, because it's a difference in lightness. And they would definitely call these darker squares at the bottom black instead of black, as the English speakers did. What was interesting is that in the bilinguals, there was a lot of overlap around the boundaries. So there were bilinguals that would call this square dark blue. This one, can you see it? Yeah. And or they would call this one Galaska. Whereas it's not really, it's dark, it's dark blue. So it's, is it some people, some colleagues actually would call it confusion, some kind of like semantic, reorganization. I would say it's probably a weakening of the link between the term and the semantic denotation. Once that starts happening, well, you're not confused, but you just don't care anymore. You're like, okay, it's kind of like black, Alaska, whatever. And then the longer you've stayed in the country, the more these links, I think, weaken. I can tell you personal anecdotes as a bilingual, going back and forth, between my different countries and how things jumpstart again or weaken. But this is it basically when it comes to boundaries.
And then the other question was for the Hancock one, the second language was Japanese, right? They were L2 Japanese speakers.
Yeah.
So if you have an idea why they, in Japanese, they seem to choose the safe option consistently less often, because logic would have dictated out a bit, if we're using logic, logic would have dictated they would have chosen the safe option more, because you said you're less likely to take bigger risks in a second language than in your first language. So it seems they took the safe option considerably less, which seems to go against that, so I'm a bit confused.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think the way that the researchers would interpret this is a difference between the two versions, the sure and the risky version, the gain and the loss version, and the fact that you don't find it in the second language. But you're right, if you look at the global pattern, they seem to actually, more often than not, go for the risky option, not the sure option. I mean, it's around 40%. You could even say they're a chance, almost. So here, I don't know why this happens. There's a big debate whether the reported effects are down to emotionality in and of itself. So whether it is really because the first language is connected to the emotional centers of the brain, or whether we tend to think more analytically in the second language, but emotion has nothing to do with it. So if you take the second route, we simply just tend to think more analytically in our second language, then having behavior that's around chance isn't that surprising, because you're thinking, well, they're both the same, aren't they? Who's he trying to fool, And so you respond accordingly. I think, but I'm just guessing, I don't know. It's very early days with these experiments. I know from my students' work, the effect here, this is very robust, for all the different scenarios that she had. She even had some scenarios here that were self-preservation scenarios. So let me just think of one that won't shock me. So there was one where you are diving with 5 other people, and one of your colleagues, their diving suit rips and there's blood coming out, and the sharks are coming to eat everybody. And so your choice there is to cut the cord that connects your friend to the rest and let the sharks have him, and save the rest, right? So this is the dilemma. But this time, you are in it as well. Your skin is there because you are saving, and surprisingly, we found the same effect. So if you think about this in your second language, you are more likely to cut the cord and let your friend die than if you did in your first language. And this is what actually surprised us. I thought there would be no effect there because it's a part.
Thank you. Next question.
Yes, so for the colors, you mentioned that the Greek speakers who had English as a second language who were on a long stay here in the UK. There are differences for the electrodes that they have. It was smaller, as in if they didn't notice as easily as the Greek speakers who were on a short stay. So my question is, if it's used because rather than having a second language, that difference, it's not because of having a second language, but because living on a place that has a different language. So as is the fact, it's not just simply not learning a second language rewires your brain, but living on a place that uses a different language wherever you use your brain, and it's reversible, this process.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and I think one that we still cannot answer, not just in these types of studies, but in the more straightforward SLA study, second language acquisition study. It's very difficult to define proficiency and what it's made up of, and you have length of immersion, but what does that mean? How do you quantify that? You ask somebody, how long have you stayed in this country? But I know people that have stayed in this country for 30 years and still don't speak any English. It depends what you do when you are in the country. With us, we had several variables that we considered. One of them was linguistic proficiency as measured by a general proficiency test, like the Oxford Placement Test. That did not correlate with behavior at all. It was length of stay that correlated with behavior. Some people interpret the effect of length of stay as a visual diet effect, because you're in the UK, you see less of the Greek blues. If you go on Google and type in Greek holidays, nice skies and whatever, not like this lovely grey that or maybe there are different shades of grey, I don't know. But it's so the one idea is that because the longer you stay here, your visual system becomes less sensitive to the distinctions. But this is why we have the green as well, because that is our control here. Because it's the reverse with the green. The more you stay in the UK, I mean, the UK generally has more different shades of green that you can see in Greece, at least in most parts of Greece. And we don't find any effects, for the green. So it can't just be visual diet. There's something more to it. But all we can say is that the longer you have stayed in the second language speaking country, the more your perception changes. But why? We don't know. Because length of stay could be a proxy for proficiency, frequency of language users, anything.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask about, in your study, when it came to finding participants, did you know anything about how they became bilingual? Was it were they born with parents that were teaching them English and Greek, or were they learning the Greek at home and then they learned English at school? And if so, did that factor any consideration to whether their results were different? Then is there a difference between the sequential bilingual acquisition and the simultaneous acquisition?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So just to give you a little introduction to the answer to the question, is that I use the term bilingual very liberally. So yeah, there are fierce debates, who are the true bilinguals and whether it's second language, whatever. If you use a second language, you're bilingual because you're using it. If I use Japanese to order a beer, then I'm being multilingual in Japanese. It's not. Yeah, I mean, that's what language is, right? Usage, function, Anyway, but there is a real question regarding early and late bilinguals, right? And this has to do with brain maturation and how the plasticity of the brain as you get older. Now, the majority of the studies, including my study, has been done on sequential bilinguals. People that have started learning the second language in childhood, even, but after the first language had sort of been acquired. Why? Because it's more practical to find these people. So it's rare that you can actually find a large sample of, unless you actually work at a university that is in a bilingual region, like in Wales, for example. It's difficult. What we do know from the few studies that have looked at early bilinguals is that the system seems to be more merged. So you don't get these clear-cut shifts in behavior. The behavior is more kind of in between, or it will share elements from both languages. Whereas with the late bilinguals, you even find shifts as a function of language context. So we haven't done this with color, but we've done it with other domains like time and motion. You really can behave differently in these experiments if you're a late bilingual, depending on the language that you receive the instructions in, or the language that you operate in. And the reason is maybe not that different from the reason I mentioned regarding emotionality earlier, how you learn your first language in emotional context and your second language in a detached classroom, whatever. And I think it's probably the same with late bilinguals, because you learn the languages, not just only apart in time, but in different contexts as well. So contextually already, you've kind of embedded your learning style. It has been embedded in these different ways. So maybe that's why you behave differently. But we are, again, at a very early stage when it comes to early bilinguals in these studies.
Very good.
I have a quick question related to Gary's ones, but I'm kind of curious about the process when you're doing the scenario experiment. So you will give your participants two scenarios in the same language, like gain and lose. In fact, what is that? Frame. But then, so you choose two groups of people, one do say in English and one do in Japanese, and then the both effect, the gain effect and loss effect. So do you give them also like questionnaires to kind of get in, because they are two different groups of people, and so based on what they choose to do English, to do in their language one or the foreign language, is it random, or is it kind of like they got the chance to choose, or if you give them like a survey or questionnaire and then you select them to do either in the L1 and L2 and to see the effects? I want to know kind of who are they and how are they different?
Yeah, thank you. That's actually a fundamental question. And it also speaks to the question that I received earlier about why is it that these people that did it in the second language were close to chance here. So this study here, it's not my study, so I'm going to criticize it. So this study here uses a cross-sectional design, right? A between subjects design. So different people, these are different people from these people here. So the sampling is random. So you randomly allocate participants to either the L1 condition or the L2 condition. The big problem that you have is that you allow in a lot of X factors to creep into your data. And this is what people that analyze data really hate. We don't want the unknown. We want our data to be as controlled as possible. And here, because there are different people, you have lots of unknown variables. Typically, you try to control for proficiency levels, that they are of comparable proficiency, and via questionnaires and age of acquisition and things like that. But still, they're different people. You don't know whether you are really showing a foreign language effect here or just a random, consequential difference between two different sets of bilinguals. But my student study, these are the same people. So they are, and we induce language modes here. So they start, for example, they start experiment in English, and they see like an English advertisement, in English, and a little like a video as well of somebody speaking English. This goes back to Grosjean's 98 about language modes, how you can induce a language mode. And then they have to do the dilemmas in English. And then halfway through the task, we give them an irrelevant task, half an hour passes, and then we give them the same thing, but in Greek. So they have to watch a Greek news report and blah, blah, blah. And we'll give them dilemmas in Greek, and not the same dilemmas that we give them in English, but different ones, but of course we counterbalance, it's 4x4, like you can go crazy with it, but you have to do it, if you want to have to trust your results. So this is a thing why you also will get a much bigger effect here, because it's the same people, doing this. So you get a better measure of a true foreign language effect. And I haven't shown you this data, but we also looked at language proficiency here. Intermediate proficiency speakers versus advanced proficiency speakers. Because again, previous studies using these bad cross-sectional designs were finding the effects more in intermediate speakers than in advanced speakers. And their thinking was that, well, if you're an advanced speaker, it's likely that you've become more emotional with a language, with a second language. It's possible, However, they're still different people, and you don't know whether it is really proficiency or just something else. Here with this, apply, we found this for intermediate proficiency speakers, but also for advanced proficiency speakers, which again, you know, casts a little bit of doubt as to how much affect is involved, because yes, as you are progressing, if you're advanced in your second language, maybe, you know, you are more emotionally attached to it. But yeah, it's early days, you know, so, but at least for now, we can say that proficiency isn't a factor. You find the foreign language effects in all levels of proficiency.
Should we trying specifically to find intermediate level people because you're worried that advanced people will be more like emotionally invested in the languages directly? It's a very bad thing to do if you're trying to prove that there is a lower level of emotion, because you're just deliberately getting rid of people who you think will have more emotion.
Yeah, no, I mean, so yeah, you're right, of course. You shouldn't deliberately choose your participants to fit your hypothesis. But I think what happened in the early studies, it was just one of those random effects. You know, you test a bunch of people, especially bilinguals, where there's a lot of heterogeneity in the sample, and then you try post hoc to look at the data. You say, oh, we have length of stay, we have proficiency, we have, you know, and then some studies found that, oh, look, in advanced, bilinguals with advanced proficiency, there's less of a foreign language effect. So proficiency must be a factor. But also in these studies, proficiency was measured. I don't want to say this, I'm embarrassed. You know, proficiency was measured by just one question: how proficient you are in your second language, 1 to 5. Really? Yeah. But these are psychologists. Are there any psychologists? These are psychologists doing this research, so they're not clued up, you know, with how sophisticated concepts like proficiency are, how you need to measure it. So my student came to the rescue. So she looked at, she used proficiency, like formal proficiency test, fluency test. Yeah, so her main question is this: does proficiency matter when it comes to foreign language effect? And she finds that it doesn't.
I think Panos has been the absolutely appropriate choice for this. I want to get to the point where we can let him off the hook and stop grilling him. But do we have any other questions? I have one, just to actually get out of the discipline. I know that you've done TED Talks. I know that you are one of the few who is trying to translate this to wider audiences. And you have also developed a language to speak about the importance of this across. So when you talk outside the context of our discipline, and what do you see, or have you seen stakeholders who are not, in terms of the academic impact? The questions are fascinating, they are fundamental. Who do you see in terms of making those sort of transitions and transcending the boundaries of academia and non-academia, of making use, of being interested in making use? Who is speaking up? Is any part of, I'm sort of immediately thinking of parts of the NHS who actually operate in those areas. Do you have people contacting you through the lab, or when you talk to sort of TED Talk type of environment, coming afterwards and saying, you know, this can be very relevant, we need to design a particular type of a study, of an experiment, of something, of what do you see? Do you actually see that we are in a position that we can start having those really crossings outside academic, meaningful ways? How can we do it?
I thought you were going to let me off the hook, Joe.
Well, just a little bit, for a little bit longer. And then I promise.
I think, look, I mean, the talk I did before I did this one last month was actually to a language school, by Cortex Languages, which is like an international language school in 100 countries. And I had teachers, practitioners, you know, interested in these questions. And I've also, like you said, I've done TED Talks and things like that. And I think that's, look, in one sense, I have an easy task to do. Why? Because the big idea that I'm looking at is something that is fascinating. The superior hypothesis, does language affect our thinking? Oh my God, I want to know. If you go out in the street and you ask people that know nothing about linguistics, people have an opinion about it. So it's not difficult to then, you know, kind of go from that. Even Hollywood has gotten that, you know. So I use those things as bridges, you know, to kind of break down the ideas to its simplest, you know, common denominators, and then go from there. And then I will show some brainwaves, for example, here, because I'm at the university, to the practitioners who may translate this differently, or to teachers. In terms of very, very specific, you know, expertises and whether they want to know more about how this can impact their work. Well, you'd be surprised because they also come to my talks simply because of the popular science stuff. You know, like they love the idea of, oh, maybe language affects, maybe it doesn't affect, maybe we all think the same, but maybe, you know, there are different, you know. So I think it's just something that captures people's, it's one of those, and you mentioned philosophy as well. Lots of philosophers are interested in that. I've given the same talk in philosophy departments. My God, the questions that you get there, really different. Yeah, I was talking about time perception, and I had one of the most difficult questions that could only come from a philosopher. And he said, okay, so with color perception, the organ of perception is the eyes. What about with time perception? I don't know. No idea, you know? Yeah, so again, what unites the philosophers with is the same thing, you know, this interaction between language and our thinking and the way that we perceive the world. There are, I mean, more recently, there have been more attempts to make the findings more applicable to actual practices, you know. So we just finished a study looking at legal contexts and whether you frame COVID-19 as a feminine or as a masculine in Greek, you know, and whether then you perceive COVID-19 as less threatening. It's in the feminine form, it's in the masculine form. But I mean, so it was interesting because when we were doing the study with my colleague who's a law academic in Greece, we experienced a lot of distrust from experts, from judges especially. You're asking me, a judge, you know, what if I get it wrong? What if you prove that, you know, so it's difficult to kind of, you know, find common, unless people think that you will definitely show them in a good light, you know, they're not. And of course, you can't really guarantee that. You can't guarantee, there's no good or bad here, right? You know, it's science, so.
And that's basically what, in a sense, if you go back to what Tiziana was saying with, you know, bringing universities together, so we're thinking of how we can work differently in different ways, and this sort of academic, non-academic, crossing the boundaries, making the findings of studies relevant across audiences. We've been talking about it, but actually, fundamentally, we're such a long way to be able to actually have different types of collaborations, exactly for some of those issues where the implications are very real, legal, health, I mean, in a sense, all sorts of context. And there is also a question that I'm not expecting an answer to this, which is basically how, where we can do things differently to actually sort of do all these things that you do and for which we're not training the students. So we're not training the students to translate to wider audiences generally. We train our students very much to talk in an academic genre and so on, but also how we operate very much in a societal context where these transitions are still very much far from being either the norm or seen as a positive thing, exactly because of all other constraints. That, you know, working with judges is very difficult.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that it's perhaps, you know, thinking more about how you can translate your findings and leaving it out there for people to then come to you to make those connections. I mean, I see it a lot, you know, how funding has changed, especially in the UK, with this whole like obsession with impact and how you have, you know, research must have immediate impacts. And what you've lost there is game changers. It's people that come, that do blue skies research and completely transform your thinking. And that, nobody's going to fund that because where is the immediate, you may have a societal benefit in 50 or 100 or 2,000 years, who knows, you know, but science loses out, you know, when you focus too much on translating your findings, you know, things like that. So, look, I'll be honest, from my perspective, translating my findings is fun. That's it, you know. I mean, I'd love to, of course, you know, in a talk, I've given medical professionals, talks to medical professionals and lawyers and things like that. But that's not my goal. You know, my goal is to do, well, first to do the science and have a good, you know, study, no cross-sectional designs and things like that. And then my other goal is to have fun with it, you know, and see what's, and that's why I said I'm a little bit lucky because, I don't know, if I was looking at the subjunctive in Portuguese or something, maybe it wouldn't translate. Yeah, exactly, yeah, there you go. I mean, yeah, it's also, you know, just luck of the draw, I don't know.
But there is definitely, as you say, it's the pendulum, right? So in the sense that I was actually thinking that we either sort of all shift and we pay a lot of lip service, but there are no conditions, or then we go back, or we lose the balance. And actually, whether and how much, what you said about the fun of it. I mean, learning needs to be fun. Research also, there is a lot when you're passionate about, when you actually find things that actually are sort of good. And I think for the students here, I mean, fun in learning is so important, right? When you actually learn things which you're passionate about, I think that's the way to go on.
I agree. And actually, you know what? I think that if you think specifically about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and ideas like that, you have to be always prepared for the possibility that it's correct, that your language actually has an effect on how you think, and maybe it's putting blinkers on you, right? So why am I saying this? Because I know over the years, I've always tried to collaborate with psychologists, neuroscientists, and things like that. And I have other colleagues that have done the same. What I would say works more often than not is if you speak their language rather than expecting them to speak your language. Right? Simply because you're a linguist and you do all these fancy things, you can't expect them to know anything. So you approach it like this, and then you actually read their papers, even if you don't understand anything, you know, and then you just try and you know, speak their language. And then you find people are much more willing to talk to you and collaborate. If you come, you know, on your high horse, this is what we're doing, this is, you know, mighty and all that, then yeah, people are going to be less willing to talk to you. So learning another disciplinary language, I think, is important here, you know, to cross those bridges.
Yeah, there's a question online. We have time for one last question.
Okay, I mean, yes, no, fair enough, because it was much more difficult to engage with our online colleagues. So yes, please go ahead, read it through.
Yeah, so going back to the studies that you showed us, have these same tests been done using different bilingual language pairs to see if the languages and where they come from in the world make a difference to the outcomes?
The studies on the foreign language effect, or
Probably I think
yeah. So for the foreign language effects, yeah, it has been done with different combinations of bilinguals. It doesn't matter what language it is, as long as it is a first language versus a second language that was acquired later. It's interesting that it hasn't been done in early bilinguals because it assumes that there would be no foreign language effects then. They're early bilinguals. But yeah, there are many different constellations, combinations. It's again, whoever you can find, you know, wherever the study is conducted, those will be the bilingual sample that will take part.
Thank you very much. It has been really great. I knew it would have been. I think you exceeded the expectations that I did in my introducing you and passing the floor to you. Thank you again for making time and being so generous. Also for being so well prepared and curating this in a way that has been really great to set the tone for the rest of the week. And it has been a great pleasure to see that the passion and enthusiasm still drives the agenda. So, and long it may last. So please join me to thank you. So you'll now be off the hook. Thanks, everybody.